Hello there. Welcome, everybody. We have got nearly 107. We've got nearly 170 participants in the session at the moment, and the counter keeps going up, which is fantastic. And you are most welcome. And to some of you, it is a welcome back. And to some of you, it is a particularly special welcome because this session was designed for you. And those are you, this session is for those of you who run your own businesses, for those of you that are responsible for businesses, and that has to guide those businesses through this very brave new world that we find ourselves in. So my name is Louise Klaasen, and I'm going to be your host for these sessions. And while I tell you a little bit more about these sessions, I would like to invite you to use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen and just tell us a little bit about who you are. So if you could check in effect, and let us know who you are, what kind of a business you run, and what you're hoping to get from these sessions, it will help us, and specifically our panelists and our speaker that we have with us today, Andrew Godley, John Foster Pedley, and absolutely not least, Musa Kalenga, who will be our speaker today to get to know a little bit about you. Thank you so much. Okay, dokie, and the counter keeps going up. So I'm going to ask everybody except for our 3 guests today, Andrew, John, and then also Musa, to just please, if you can put your video off for me, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And then I want to tell you a little bit about the series that you find yourself in. So over the next 12 days, we've put a series of conversations together for you under the header of Survival and Digital Transition in Tough Times. Now they come in 4 different themes. The first 3 sessions deals with the theme of survival. Not survival so much as stabilization. So how do we stabilize things? Okay. How do we just get to a place of level, stop, can think? From there, we move to assess. So what are the options that you have from a digital perspective? What are the possibilities out there from a business model perspective, but also from a tool point of view? And once you've had a look at those, and we've been able to think about those together, then the next question is, how do you start to pivot? How do you make the changes? Because the business of yesterday is not necessarily going to function in the same way as the business of tomorrow. So some things will shift. And what might that be, and how might that happen? So that's the pivot piece. And then from there, let's move together into the grow piece again. So those are the 4 sessions. Now, I would like to call on our Dean, Prof. John Foster Pedley, who has a remarkable gift for framing and reframing things, to tell us a little bit more about why this particular session came about and what the urgency was that he drove within Henley Africa for us to get this up and running and off the ground. So John, can I tag you in? Over to you.
Thanks, Louise. Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Right, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's a really important set of sessions. I'm really grateful, and very grateful to the team who set this up, and also very grateful Professor Andrew Godley from Centre for Entrepreneurship in the UK is here with his team, because they're an award-winning Centre for Entrepreneurship, and they've got phenomenal advice and help to give from their successes in helping entrepreneurial organizations in the UK. So obviously the big challenge that we're facing around SMEs is the enormous danger now for SMEs in this COVID period that we will lose business and they'll crash and burn. And there are a number of things we can do to help, particularly in helping organizations migrate from face-to-face businesses to more virtual. And we've got capabilities and people who can really share knowledge and practical advice how to do that. And in this series, you're going to hear a number of people talking about that in quite a structured way, talking about how the tools are virtual, what you can do, what your choices are, how to practice them, and then how to build a business model and a collaborative environment within your organization to work in the virtual environment as well. But the contextual challenges are quite huge. We've got something like 525,000 small and medium enterprises in small, medium and micro enterprises in South Africa. And that risks something like 6.6 million direct jobs if they don't succeed, plus also the dependencies around that, you know, so maybe 10 million people or more affected in this sector. And also they represent some of the growth engines of a more diversified economy, away from the sort of smokestack industries of South Africa, digging things out the ground and selling them. And that structure hasn't changed much over the last years in South Africa either. So we need to evolve our economy. And at the moment, surveys are saying that something like 60% of SMEs are considering retrenching employees or already have. And that's really dangerous for us, particularly as we will come out of this at some point. And if we haven't managed to survive, we've got to start up those organizations again, which takes tremendous effort. Rather than sustaining them, keeping them alive, sort of bounce back is much more powerful, because there will be a bounce back. After the recession period we'll go through, there will be a period of growth. We might go into negative 5 or 6%, but after that we're probably looking at plus 4 or 5% growth. So that's important to us as well. The CEO initiative, which is a part of business, which is supporting business for South Africa, which is a grouping of large businesses, academics and others, of which I'm part of one. I'm helping run the innovation of the economy stream of that. They are calling on large companies to pay their SME creditors now, yesterday in fact, to help keep them alive. We can do things like reduce the VAT rate. You know, we could have a temporary suspension of PAYE for employees. That would help. Payment holidays on loans or payment holidays on rents for SMEs, or one-off allowances for households that are battling, for example, or an increase in the VAT threshold for SMEs, and temporary relief on payments to UIF. All these will help. But you've got about 5 things that we need to work on to help with SMEs. The first is liquidity. How are you going to keep liquidity in the organization? You've got to shore up cash by drawing down available facilities, not make unnecessary investments to manage your cash flow daily. Second, you've got to get your best team on this, and that's really important. You need leadership now. You can't control the circumstances, but we can control our response and the actions. This will help create certainty for people. We need to be more hands-on, and so events move quickly, and leaders can't be separate from events. You've got to be right in there, moving and sensing the events. You've got to have very good peripheral vision and situational awareness, and use data to understand. And then you've got to help with your policies. So your policies need to be able to adjust quickly. You can't be trapped by old policies. You've got to get ready to get rid of the old and move new ones in. It's the time for the bold. I think it was Helen Keller who said that security is only a superstition. And in times like this, you need bold activism and a bold sense of adventure. And that's what we need. So some organizations are more sort of susceptible to the changes here. And in the last sort of 30 seconds ago, I'll just say, for example, if you're dependent on large face-to-face gatherings, you're susceptible. If you need close human interaction in your business, then of course these close down and distancing will make it more dangerous for you. If hygiene is really important, that's going to make you susceptible to people pulling away. If your business is dependent on travel or tourism or leisure, for example, then you're very susceptible. If your product can be put off for a while, then people will delay the purchase, and you'll have very high impact. So the thing here is, how can you move products and services that were once very face-to-face into virtual? So ourselves in education, it's very possible for us to do that. As you're seeing now, we're able to shift from face-to-face to virtual. So this series will help you with all those sort of ideas, all those things. And I hope you're going to find these 12 or more sessions that are brought to you by these really, really talented people, extremely helpful in supporting your business. And we really want this to be helpful, useful. It's not academic, it's a service to the nation, and I hope it works for you.
Thanks so much, John. Tom would like to know, where do you get that fabulous shirt?
This was given to me on one of my large decade birthdays by my very best friend Nigel, who I've known for about 50 years. And because I'm a very poor guitarist, I wear a very good guitar shirt to make up for my skills. But I love the shirt. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, John. And before I hand over to Andrew, quite a few of you shared with us who you are and where you come from. And the range of people that we have in this community on this call is just amazing. I want to give a shout out to Nadine, who says that she has a little bakery that specializes in bespoke cakes and biscuits. It's been growing to a point where she can no longer do it herself. And she's been bringing extra people in, but it's been hard because it's come to a standstill. But despite that, she is still looking at growing that business. So thanks, Nadine. I'll be calling out others that are doing just the most extraordinary range of things. But before I do that, Andrew, one of the things that makes the series of ours so extraordinary is that this is a partnership that digs into the broad, big Henley ecosystem. And you head up the Henley Centre for Entrepreneurship in the UK. And in fact, many of the speakers that will participate in the series comes from that part of the world. Please will you share with us a little bit about that Centre for Entrepreneurship, but also what are you seeing that is happening to SMEs in your part of the world?
Thanks very much, Louise. That's a very generous introduction. We're delighted to be able to contribute to this series, to pass on as much as we can that we are observing around us in the UK, and a little bit about the lessons that we've learned about how to digitize your business and grow. I think probably let me just say a little bit about us. So Henley Business School, as you will all know, is a big business school. It's a global business school. It has branches, obviously in Europe, in the UK, in continental Europe, and in Asia, as well as the great superstar in Johannesburg that's led by none other than JFP. So we have a lot of resource that we're able to corral from around the world and then disseminate to different audiences. And so we're just delighted to be able to support all of you people in South Africa who are trying to cope with lockdown as we are here. We set up the Henley Centre for Entrepreneurship about 10 years ago, after I'd been working for the British government for about 10 years. And I've been working for them, trying to help them work out how to support SMEs, how to support British small businesses to grow, to get more sales, to become more productive. And one of my major roles in that was to travel all around the country and to meet and interview thousands of small business owners. And I have to say, the results of that were not terribly encouraging. I think that my overriding conclusion was that most, overwhelmingly, 80–90% of the small businesses that I'd met were really vulnerable to competitive threat. And in particular, the conclusion that I drew from that was that they were really vulnerable because they didn't really understand their consumers. They didn't really understand how markets were. They understood their products. You know, they really understood what they were making and what they were trying to produce for their consumers, but they just didn't understand why consumers would want to buy their products. And so the hallmark of the Henley Centre for Entrepreneurship is this real focus on sales, on selling, and the underlying behaviors that can help entrepreneurs and small businesses to understand consumers and why consumers buy. So that's really what we're wanting to bring to the party over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks in this 12 lessons. It's what we're doing in the UK, in Europe. Lockdown over here has obviously been a massive disruption. But during times of disruption, there are opportunities. During times of disruption, there are moments where you see entrepreneurs rise. And I'm sure that in South Africa, over these coming weeks, we will hear stories of entrepreneurs rising to the challenge of lockdown. Just in the last few days, I've heard of some fantastic entrepreneurial stories. Lockdown, of course, has meant that there's no retailing, or almost no retailing. And so our fishermen based around the coast of the UK are unable to get their fish to market. All the wholesalers have stopped. The retailing, they're just focusing on basics in food retailing. And so I found one company which is set up by a Cornish fisher trawling family, and they just set up their website, and they're going to do nationwide delivery of fresh fish. They're the first movers in this. They're attracting all of the families that also are trawling families in that region. And you know what? In the space of 2 weeks, they have corralled so many orders that they are booked out 3 weeks now. Otherwise, you see other retail opportunities just popping up because there are people that are willing to embrace the opportunity, willing to be able to deliver, use delivery mechanisms rather than to go through retailing that's stuck. And so it's that emphasis on trying to understand the market and understand consumers, and so overcome the obstacles that lockdown has produced that I hope we'll be able to bring to you over the course of these next few days and weeks. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think the stories are what sets us alight down here in this part of the world, and I think those will be rich and many. And I think you alluded to something, which is the revolution of the business model, and certainly from a channel point of view. And I think the more examples we hear, the more we can bring our own imaginations to it. So before I hand over to Musa Kalinga, who is a very special human and part of our Henley family, I want to just share a couple more of the introductions that you guys made through the Q&A function. So I've got Ogman Williams, who says, what if you're on the opposite side of the spectrum? Someone who's looking to start a business during this time. What are the considerations to take into account during the current volatility and risks? Well, that is a phenomenal question, because you don't come with legacy. So perhaps there is an opportunity to look at possibility with fresh eyes. And then there's Theophilus Malachi, who says that I've just recently started a visual media company. The country's present situation has really hindered my launch. That's a different perspective again. And then I've got Tabelang Mate here. He's in the ICT sector. He says he employs independent contractors as and when he gets contracts. And he says, thanks for the session. Looking forward to gleaning on the wisdom that is to be shared here. So no pressure for you, Musa Kalinga. So Musa is an entrepreneur. He is a marketer. He is a technocrat. I think he has a unique way to frame a situation, to deliver a perspective. And I cannot think of anybody better to guide us through the next 20 or 30 minutes of perhaps tilting our world and our perspective a little bit. I would like to say that as we go into this particular session is a little bit longer than the 21 lesson sessions were. For those of us that joined us for those, we'll be finishing at 5:15, so that there's plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards, because that's where a lot of the richness of these sessions lies. So Musa, can I tag you in? Can I say welcome and thank you so much for joining us?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louise. Can we all hear me clearly?
Can hear you loud and clear, Musa.
Excellent, excellent. All right, thank you for that. I mean, I'm very excited to share some thoughts, and in fact, a couple of frameworks I've been kicking around while I've had lots of time in lockdown to think about things that are obviously very important to the nation, important to the world, but because I am an entrepreneur as well, very important to me. So I've just kind of put together some thoughts around response strategies for the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll be kind of sharing how you apply them specifically to your organization. Because I think one of the things that we can all probably understand is that this moment in time requires us to think about how we adapt in a very different way. If we consider looking at a creature or an animal like a chameleon and how it adapts because it's able to change its color and its shape to match into the surrounding environments, it does this because it's trying to survive. And for lots of businesses that have been confronted with the challenge that we currently have, are finding themselves in a very similar situation to a chameleon, and some are finding it easier than others to be able to adapt and survive. And so a big part of what I'm going to be speaking about today is two really important concepts which are key for me and the way I think about the world. The first is understanding humanity. And I was going through my LinkedIn feed and I found this particular quote by the president of the Republic of Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo, who says, "We know how to bring economies back to life, but we don't know how to bring people back to life." And why I thought this was beautiful and very poignant is the response of a lot of African governments, and in particular South African government, has taken into account the human aspect of all their decisions at every point and has put it front and center to how they've been navigating this COVID-19 crisis. Why that is critical is I believe the point at which we at as humans is that we have to prioritize humanity over everything that we do. And so some of the decisions which are hard to digest and hard to understand are often driven by this human-based approach, which I think is critical to surviving, but I think very important to how I think about the world as well. The second quote I came across, which was also interesting to consider, those of you that are petrol heads or like racing, I'm quite into Formula One. This great quote that speaks about a sharp turn in the road is only dangerous if you forget to turn, frames up such an important reality. And if you think about how Formula One drivers drive really fast, they understand how to take an apex of a corner. And the apex of a corner effectively is a sweet spot at which the angle of the direction you're coming in changes to the angle which you're going out of the corner. And what's important about negotiating a sharp turn in the road is that there's three very important phases. There's a phase where you have to slow down and take cognizance of the turn. There's a phase where you have to enter from a wide berth and into the corner. And then there's a phase where you accelerate out of that corner. And so that's the one way that we can think about this, is that, you know, the COVID-19 crisis literally has just been a bend in the road and everybody has been completely thrown off. And so the big thing that we need to console ourselves with as value creators and entrepreneurs is that it's only dangerous if you don't turn. And the danger there is that you don't respond to what needs to happen. The road itself won't be able to respond to you. You have to respond to the road. And part of what we'll talk about today is what are these responses that allow us to navigate? Because if we truly believe in this as an opportunity, and I've been telling a lot of people that they shouldn't be thinking about going back to the way things were, they should think about it as a new opportunity for technology to reframe realities. And using these two kind of very polar views of the world, which is technology and humanity, we need to think very clearly about how we create what I refer to as a new value. Because in this world, and with the consumers that we face and with this crisis that we have, there's been no better time for us to think about this idea around new value. And new value is looking at unrelated things and potentially bringing them together to create new things that no one ever really needed, services that people didn't desire, but now are ultimately super valuable because of the context that we find ourselves in. And so navigating through all of this, we have to take cognizance of what was happening just before we hit this COVID-19 crisis. All of you will be very well aware that there was very slow growth if we look at South Africa. I think growth had been revised down since the 2018 policy statement. And so there was this kind of fragile road to recovery, and we're really struggling to figure out where we're going to get growth from the economy. We also know that the need to stimulate economic activity was top of mind for the South African government, because we needed to create a higher rate of growth and more inclusive growth as we grew at the same time. And while we were doing that, we had to tackle the fact that we've got a massive base of unemployed people. In particular, young people between the ages of 18 to 25. And if we also take a step back and think about South Africa's reality in the context of Africa as a continent. Now, Africa constitutes 17% of global population, 17%, but we only account for 3% of GDP. And I've been reading lots of theories that this is, you know, very difficult as a context, but could it be that it's an opportunity for even the African economy to reset itself on its own terms and according to its own rules? And these are the things that are really important to reflect on, because as we think about those things, we can start to respond better to the COVID crisis. Now, this is the gloomy picture that we had before everything hit. In the words of Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So we all sat and we did strategic planning. We all had great projections. We all had amazing operational plans. And we hoped that we're going to find ourselves in a place where we're going to execute them and drive growth through this financial year until we were hit in the face by this pandemic. And as everybody got hit in the face, we had to really figure out how to stabilize ourselves, how to recalibrate and move forward. So if we think about the four components of today's conversation, stabilization is really important. That has to be followed by a clear view and assessment of the environment, and that informs how you pivot or you swivel your business into a new growth trajectory. And so what I'll do is I'll take you through all four of those components with some thinking that I've put together based on our experience, based on some of the observations I've seen, but also hopefully to give you a bit of a tool to kind of go back and do as the exercises within your own business. So I'll start with stabilization. I think we've all seen the three different economic scenarios, the V shape, the U shape, and the L shape. which is a mild, medium, and severe economic impact. And a lot of people think that South Africa is most likely going to end up going into an L shape, which effectively means there's a drastic shock in the beginning to the economy, and there'll be a long period before we actually ever recover. I'm slightly more optimistic than that. I think it's probably going to be a more U-shaped recovery in my view. But it's important for you to think about the context of the macro environment before you contextualize your own business. The second most important step, and I think where small businesses miss out, is they stop at this level. They kind of go, oh geez, this is the macro view, and therefore, we're all doomed. And to some extent, it's a data point, but it's not the whole picture. So I believe the second level of exercise that you need to do as a small business is look at your industry or look at your sector more specifically and try to apply the same logic to that. And I'll give you my example. I'm an investor and I'm one of the co-founders in a technology company called Bridge Labs. And I looked at these three different scenarios, and I looked at information technology, I looked at software engineering, and I thought to myself, which is likely to be the curve that our industry is going to follow? And it's plausible that any of these three could apply. But after looking at a few different variables, I think that we're probably going to have more of a V-shaped impact in the software engineering space. And that V-shaped impact is going to depend on what we do in the short and the immediate short term. And so when you stabilize your business, it's followed by two sets of actions, the next day and next week actions. So when we realize that our V-shape in our industry is likely to be a quick shock and then recovery, it means that for us to recover, we have to consider this scenario to be able to create a list of impactful things we can implement today. And so when we started to get a lot of feedback and a lot of information relating to the COVID crisis, some projections around how long it was going to take, et cetera, we started making decisions the following day. We put our entire engineering team on work from home the day after we found out that there is a potential of a crisis. We started negotiating immediately some conversations with some of our core suppliers. And then we created a list of the things that we could impact and we could drive the following day. The second thing we did is we looked at the next week actions. And the next week actions are kind of the broader stakeholder group. Some of our big clients, some of the people that obviously are core to our success as far as our revenue projections are concerned, as well as people that inform the direction of our company and our business. And with these two sets of actions, we were able to look at the number one, the macro curve in terms of economic recovery, as well as the sector curve, which we believe is likely to be the path that we're going to take, and define two sets of actions and start to implement those actions immediately. So I think that's a key thing for small, medium enterprises to do, is to understand the macro context, but always overlay that with your industry or your sector to be able to be very clear about the immediate actions that you have to take. The next thing you do is you assess. And I think assessment is really important because you have to understand two very clear axes. The first axis is what I refer to as implementation agility. And this is all about the agility, the ability to respond quickly and the ability to implement decisions and drive new standards of operations within your business. The second axis is mental resolve. And this is interesting because it's actually just the concept of making peace with the new reality, making peace with the external variables that impact your business, but actually recalibrating through deliberate action. And according to these three axes, you can find yourself in one of four quadrants. One, you can be in the high implementation agility and low mental resolve quadrant, which effectively means you're going to be nostalgic. You're going to be doing a lot of things in a rocking chair, going back and forth, but actually not really progressing your business. And the nostalgia is going to be about dreaming about when things go back to how they used to be. And if that's going to be your point of view, effectively, you're not going to be able to get much value. The second quadrant is about reinvention. And that's the quadrant where you'll be ready to thrive. You'll be able to have the ability, the agility to be able to implement, but you'll also have made peace with the fact that this is a new reality and a new curve. The third quadrant is a stagnation, which is effectively a pity party. So you will not be able to implement, your agility will be low. And secondly, you will have not made peace with the fact that the world has completely changed. And the last, which is where a lot of South African companies find themselves, I believe, is compliant, but very complacent. And compliant means you've done everything, you've ticked all the boxes, you've been able to respond adequately, but have you actually done anything to fundamentally move your business forward? And a lot of people are ticking the boxes and are kind of waiting. And this fourth quadrant is actually very dangerous because this is where the future will happen to you as opposed to you responding decisively to the future as a small business. And so a key question to ask yourself, I think as a reflection and just to make a note of it, is what does your business model look like after COVID-19? And the reality of your business model is who are the people that you service and what is it that you do that is unique to you and how is it that you'll be able to turn that into commercial value? So I think it's very important to reflect on this deeply as a small business and entrepreneur because this is the reality that you have to face, especially if you're going to be in the second quadrant about reinvention and preparing the business and the organization to thrive going forward. a lot of CEOs have got different and varying views on how they've been handling communication relating COVID-19. And for small businesses, I think it's good to take a leaf out of the corporate sleeve sometimes. One of the big things that we need to look at is that 70% of CEOs have been asked to characterize how they've been communicating during the crisis. And a lot of them have been speaking about this notion that this is a time to restore balance. It's a time for people to kind of think about how things have been. It's a time to reflect on what could have been changed. And it's an honest opportunity to try and make good on trying to do things better and different. So if we take this leaf out of CEOs, out of the book of the CEO, we need to think about this as small businesses. Is although it may be the reality that we're in a very different time, the notion around restoration of balance is really important because it also informs our business models. We're all very aware that the world is changing fundamentally. So the way we've been creating value and being responsible about things like the environment, social, political, economics, about how we kind of create value, the value chain process, all of that has typically been quite out of balance. And so if we think about the opportunity, it does bring us kind of home, and it asks us to reflect on how do we play our part in restoring balance to the bigger picture. And so in this reflection, we can also think about this new kind of trajectory around value creation. And the pivot is interesting because this kind of very basic diagram, and I think this is very typical of South Africa, and I thought it was quite fun to try and look at it, is that when we're thinking about value, we have to consider two interesting axes. The first is high proficiency, and proficiency is how well do you do the thing that you claim to do, and how professional are you at delivering that service as a small business. The second axis is around relationships. Right? So we all know that businesses are driven by relationships, and it's important to be able to have relationships to be able to attain your goals. But in South Africa in particular, I think we've over-indexed on relationships. And I thought to myself, if we're to compare that up and try and see how small businesses can plot themselves with their proficiency versus their relationships, what can that help them unlock around where the value may sit for the organization? And so in this first quadrant, when we look at high proficiency and deep relationships, this is where I believe really high impact entrepreneurs sit. They've got really key strategic relationships, and they've got an amazing amount of proficiency and value that they can add, and they do that very well. On the other hand, there's these organizations, which I refer to as high-value legacy organizations, that have got high proficiencies, but typically very shallow relationships. And they struggle to get themselves and reinvent themselves into the new economy, reinvent themselves around a new consumer segment. And you find a lot of financial services businesses, especially the small to medium companies, are typically in this space. They typically have high value, but they've not been able to develop deep enough relationships in new segments and new markets for them to survive. And then this quadrant at the bottom, some of you may recognize it. And if this is your quadrant, we are all friends here, so not to fret. What I refer to as the tenderpreneurs quadrant, where typically the proficiency happens to be quite low in most cases, but the relationships are quite deep. And the relationships have been driven by a number of different things. And in our context, we all understand where South Africa is coming from. And so the relationships that drive and fuel entrepreneurship typically are because of patriarchy, are because of people that have known people that have been there for a while. And so people kind of pay it forward without a focus on proficiency, but rather over-indexing on relationship. And then in this last quadrant, some of you maybe have asked the question already around if you're a startup, you're trying to create value from scratch and you're starting this thing from the beginning. And you typically will probably have low proficiency and shallow relationships. In some cases, if you're specialized, you may have moderate proficiency, but you're still designing the value, you're still creating how you're going to market. And so the important thing is that for organizations that are in this quadrant, they're typically trying to build strong relationships and move into the high impact space, and at the same time try and solve to be able to either build better proficiencies so they can become at least a high value organization. If we think about high value organizations, they're trying to become high impact entrepreneurs, and this means them focusing their efforts on being able to drive deeper relationships and more value. And then entrepreneurs obviously are trying to move out of that quadrant to be able to create value. Now, some of this thinking is housed in a book that I've written called Ladders and Trampolines. And if you want to get a copy, it's on Amazon, Scribd, Loot, and Take a Lot. But it literally speaks about the framework of decision-making that a lot of entrepreneurs are faced with. And the basic premise is that you're going to think about ladders as being incremental decisions and trampolines as being exponential decisions. And exponential in the context of we're living in an extraordinary time. So there's no reason why we can't start to look at our environments as extraordinary and make exponential decisions to advance a lot quicker. And so when we think about it in that context, it really helps us to understand that we can, through specific deliberate actions, actually accelerate our businesses to the next level of operation. And so the fourth phase around grow, which is post-COVID, effectively takes into consideration three pieces of the puzzle. The first is leadership, and we've been doing this quite a lot within my software engineering business and also in a few other companies I'm invested in, is that we spent a lot of time observing the behavior of especially our middle management layer during this time. We spent a lot of time listening to the kind of responses we've got. We've been spending a lot of time seeing how people are responding and adopting to this new change. And it's wonderful because it's been like a filter that's allowed us to kind of see who's actually in it and who isn't. Secondly, we've been able to give them an opportunity to kind of come up with new and creative ideas. And why that's really important is that because we're all facing an environment which we've never had experience in, it is very dangerous to take the assumption that you have all the answers and you know everything as a leader. So if you apply servant leadership to this context and you look a little bit deeper around your management structure, you can find gems of people that are able to show themselves as valuable and rise to the challenge and the occasion. The second piece of the puzzle is around process. Unfortunately, we started a work stream probably about 5 months ago to reevaluate the processes on the engineering business and to try and make them more efficient and to streamline them. And this coincided with us implementing a whole lot of new processes and procedures in the business. But it allows us to be able to get buy-in from everybody that worked from engineering right through to sales, right through the project management team. We also used these processes not to constrain people, but to liberate them. We all know that we're in a very different context now. I mean, work from home as just a concept has been something that's taken corporate South Africa by storm, because everyone was like, yeah, you can't trust them, they can't work independently, yada, yada, yada. But now all of a sudden there's no choice. So you have to use the process to liberate people, not to constrain them. And so as this work from home phenomenon is not going anywhere anytime soon, we have to try and find other ways where we can give people the power to be able to do things more autonomously. And then the third piece of this grow trajectory is around technology. So once you've been able to solve for leadership and process, you have to apply technology in a way that enables your process, your reporting, your communication, and monitoring of projects, as well as managing impact. I mean, the measurement of your organization is really important. I've got a bunch of really young engineers that work in our software engineering company. And we had a really funny process in that I used to send a lot of emails because I happen to be a millennial. So for me, emails are kind of just the way I do things. Also because it allows me to track and go back and see where I left things off and that kind of thing. But enter these kind of a younger core generation Y and Z, and they find emails to be very offensive. In fact, I used to send emails out and I never got responses, and people were really just offended. They thought an email was just such a formal way to communicate. Why can't we just kind of have a chat? Or why can't you send me a WhatsApp? And so I realized that my communication style and the way I was used to being able to drive value previously was just completely not fit for purpose. And so as we revised our processes, we started using technologies that we've been tinkering with, Slack, or the Slacks of the world, the WhatsApps of the world, the Asanas of the world. We all implemented those as primary communication channels. And we took them completely off email to be able to be in an environment where they're comfortable. Now, this did two things. The first is it obviously showed that we were responsive. It showed that I'm not kind of so married to the email that it's the only way I can work. But secondly, it put us into a situation where we're able to actually manage value a lot better, because all these platforms at their core are all data management services. And with APIs and integrations, you're able to take that information and be able to make it work for the business. And so it's actually been a wonderful thing that we implemented it. But this last piece of the puzzle, technology, will always be what you use to evolve. So being able to inform your decisions, understand how things are going, being able to use the information to kind of feed back into the process around value creation. Technology is really a fantastic option to do that. And what's also great about technology is that there's a boom of software as a service solutions, which means as medium businesses, you don't pay the full amount of kind of an enterprise solution, but you get the value that is bespoke and fitted to your business at the size that it's in. And I think these three steps, leadership, process, and technology, kind of set the businesses that have taken it quite seriously on a very different growth path from a trajectory perspective. And so the last thought I want to leave you with before we open up the discussion is Charles Darwin, who was famous for saying, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the most adaptive to change. And the most adaptable to change are going to be the ones that are going to be able to respond in a decisive way and see new value created by the use of technology, the leadership structure, as well as the processes they implement. So there's a quick thought starter for us to have a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to you guys to try and answer some more questions.
Thanks so much, Musa. That was very fast.
Pardon?
That was very fast.
Oh, I had 20 minutes.
We've had numerous requests for slides, And for versions of the video from people that are listening, I want to just let you all know that we've got more than 355 people that are on this call at the moment, that are part of this webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you very much, Musa, for that conversation starter, as you called it. So I can let you know that we will be sharing a handout that Musa will put together for us from this particular call. Can I ask you to please put any questions that you may have on the Q&A for us? And you can pose those questions to Musa, to John, to Andrew, and we'll get different perspectives from different parts of the world. We have about 20 minutes, perhaps a little bit more for our Q&A. And so we can pick that up. So let's see where we start. We have lots of interesting people on this call. I think one thing, to just close the loop from earlier, Leanne Naidu says that to the lady who runs the bakery, Louise, it's time to go digital. Blogs, recipe books, master bake, online competitions, not for taste, but aesthetic value, discussion forums on trends, vegan baking, for example, and so forth and so more. So these are where you're going to get your ideas. There is a comment from one of our participants that says that people are not focused at the moment, in his perspective, on employee wellness, and that is a concern that he has. Would any of our panelists like to comment on that? John, you mentioned at the beginning that we have 6 million people that are employed by SMMEs in our own country. What is your perspective on that, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in right now?
Okay, just repeat the core of the question again. I missed the exact point.
The perception is that there is a lack of concern for people's wellness, for their mental and physical health and well-being at the moment.
I think that's quite paradoxical, because on one hand, there's an enormous concern for people's wellness, and as evidenced by the rapid shutdown by the government, far ahead of some governments internationally, one of the fastest, in fact, in the world, other than New Zealand, at the earliest stage. So that strongly evidenced a huge humanity and a choice to put people's lives ahead of the economy. You've seen in other countries, they're making other decisions. You know, we could get up between, if something like 300, 400,000 people could die in South Africa through COVID, but by making a choice to close down, there's some economic consequences. If the economic consequences are so high that more people suffer and die in the long term, then we have to really think. These are really hard decisions to make. So at that very harsh kind of fundamental level, I think there's a deep humanity made in the choices and a strong leadership evidence, not welcome by everybody, of course. In a more sort of immediate and familial situation, and in the sort of businesses and the day-to-day kind of areas we're at, I think we can do a lot more. And I think that's a huge opportunity for really intelligent and fast-moving organizations to do something. While it might attract a fair amount of charlatans and quacks in there, and we have to be very careful about the sort of peer assessment, and there are social media tools to do that, which I know that we, you know, obviously Musa and others will be able to help us with. Nonetheless, there is a real need to do a lot of support, health, counseling, wellness. And in the lockdown period, it's a wonderful opportunity for us all to think about these things and reconsider why we're doing things in our lives, and whether the goals we're chasing are so desperately important. We need profit, but we don't need profiteering. And we need to be wealthy, but we need to be rich in our lives, more importantly. And I think that's got to be spread across the country. And this is a time to make us really consider how we develop the country as a whole, and not just a small part of it.
Thanks so much, John. Musa, I have a question.
So I've got just to build on what John was saying.
Please add.
Pardon?
Please add.
Oh, thank you. So I think, you know, what I'm observing is that there's a lack of creativity in how we translate this halo of humanity into the organization. And I think it's because it hasn't necessarily had to be thought about before. And you know, everybody can attest to the fact that in the African context, there's a notion called Ubuntu, which fundamentally is about trying to figure out how you get the best possible outcome for the broadest amount of people at its core. And so if you think about that as something you don't have to explain to anybody in the context of South Africa or Africa, what hasn't happened has been how we are creatively interpreting that into the corporate world. And so now when we've got the need from a Halo perspective to be more human in our response, I don't think we've got the mechanisms yet to be able to back that up from a corporate perspective. In fact, I think if we look at HR practice as well as wellness practice, I don't think it's designed around the context of Africa. I think there's a lot of practice that's been taken from the Western context, notions around leave, how leave is structured, the tenets of what leave can be taken as an example, were not designed around our context in the African context. So I think what is lacking is a lack of creativity to interpret that humanity into the context of Africa and South Africa, and for that to be able to resonate with people that are obviously, in this case, highly impacted by the crisis.
Thank you very much. Musa, while I've got you on the line, so to speak, I have another question for you from Nchaveni, who says, how can SMEs adapt and create value for organizations post-COVID-19?
So that's a great question, and I suppose there's a few things that you have to do. The first is you have to be very clear with the priorities of different organizations and understand what is unlikely to change and understand what is highly susceptible to change. And this means that you have to be clear about the core function and operations of different organizations. If as an entrepreneur, you're able to map that out quite clearly, and it may differ from sector to sector, you will also be very clear around what different organizations consider as value that can't be compromised. If you use that as a North Star, you can start to wrap your services around a less risky set of circumstances than if you were going to be just trying to pitch across things that may not necessarily be important to the organization. The second piece is that once you've been able to articulate that for yourself, you need to reflect on what your business does and the gap between providing that solution and where your organization currently is, and then try and see if you can fill that gap as an individual, or if you can collaborate with other value creators that potentially could help you to fill that gap. Now, what's important is that we have to punch clever. We have to box smart in this scenario. And what you have to make peace with is that you may not necessarily always have the entire spec of capability or requirement to be able to meet that need that you've identified. And so the collaboration between different small companies becomes really, really important, because if you're able to identify other companies that can potentially work with you, you're now obviously being able to work together to try and ensure a more long-term and more sustainable result as an outcome. So I think if you follow those kind of two steps, it may help you to frame up an approach, but also be very practical with what you can do.
Thank you very much. There's lots of appreciation here for your thoughts and perspectives, Musa. People are finding this hugely helpful. So to all our panelists, Coraline is saying that her biggest challenge in an industry where she's seen real longevity in terms of her client relationships is that each of her clients are presently responding very differently, and that there's no perceived logic in the way that they are responding to the crisis. So she's finding it quite challenging to work with them through this particular situation. Any thoughts or any advice from your side on how she might approach these different client relationships that have some standing and longevity?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts maybe just to start with. Yeah, it's if you consider that the matrix that I showed, I mean, some clients may very well be, stuck in nostalgia, or they may very well be stagnant, right? And you and I having to provide a service to them. I think through this process, there probably has to be kind of a high level of EQ in how we approach our clients, because the reality is that everyone, all businesses are in different places, not only from a financial perspective, but the emotional state of different organizations is just different. So I think as a starting point, let's not assume that everybody's at the same level of understanding or awareness or at the same point of reference as you are. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is often, I mean, we are human beings at the end of the day. Often you have to bring people along the journey. Often you have to get into the conversation and remain in there consistently without an obvious commercial motive driving you, and be part of the journey with them. There's nothing more off-putting than kind of people that can see through the fact that you're only here because you're trying to get something from me. And I think during these times, applying a bit of EQ means that you have to be sensitive to taking your clients on the journey with you. And you have to be sensitive to the fact that the outcome of that journey may be slower than you expected, may be different to what you expected. But it is still your responsibility as someone that services that client to be able to go on that journey. And lastly, I think in the way that we approach this, let's all assume none of us knows what the outcome is. So frame up your conversations around co-creation. Frame up your conversations around trying to help work through things together. Frame up your conversations not about having the silver bullet, but about having the appetite to try and work with them. And I think that, just as a sleight of hand, changes how people can respond to you as a service provider. So I think that's it's important to keep in mind.
Beautiful. Emergence and uncertainty. John, I saw that you had something that you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I was actually reading through some of the questions as well, and it struck me that it's a lot of people have the same sort of issues. Without answering up one specifically, I just wanted to make the point that this is a series of 12 to 15 and they're very practical. So a lot of those questions people are asking, how to go virtual, what are the tools, how to manage it, how to manage virtually, will be covered in a session by Andrew and our teams together, and we'll give very practical advice, so stick with it. It's a difficult time to make these transitions. It's really hard. We don't know, as Musa said, we're moving into new territory. And like that image of his, where we've got that corner, we have to ride that road. So it's really important that we, think carefully as well. And I don't mean strategize in a big format, just think carefully in practical terms. What's the timeline? What are my 3 priorities? Where am I most vulnerable? Where are my biggest opportunities? It's always easy to cut costs and easier to see how you can cut costs right. And it always seems more dangerous to ideate and come up with new ideas. But this is a time where ideation is critical. And we really have to get the platforms in place. And we will be sharing those and sharing people know. And I'm sure that Andrew also knows a lot about this and can answer.
Andrew, before I hand this particular question over to you, I'd like to add to it, if I may. Later on in the series, we're going to bring you back, and one of the topics that you're going to be touching on is around alliances with larger businesses. From an SME perspective, should we, shouldn't we? What are the things to look out for? What are the factors that we should consider in the decision-making process? And Mohammed Abdullah asked a really, really good question. He says, many large corporations use SMEs. What can the big brother or sister, large corporates, do to help out their baby brothers or sisters out there? Would you perhaps like to comment, and perhaps that's a little bit of a teaser in terms of the conversation that we'll have with you in more depth later on in the series?
Thanks, Louise. I think that one of the things that I'd like to talk about when I come back later on is to understand the significance of relationships. So Musa's already talked about relationships and how entrepreneurs emphasize the quality of relationships. One of the things that we find in the UK is that many startups are very aware of their technology. They're very aware of their product. They're very aware of what it is that they bring to the table that is distinct and is special. And so the difficult lesson that they often have to learn is that actually the real value isn't in the new technology. That there's a chief technology officer of a Fortune 500 company in mobile telephony told me, he said, ideas are cheap. Technology is cheap. There's lots and lots of solutions to technological problems. And so we find that in our work with our entrepreneurs around where we are, which is a real technology area, just outside London, to the west of London, one of the real difficulties that our entrepreneurs face is just getting their mindset away from product, away from technology, away from the perfect solution, and focusing much more on how to solve consumer problems. And so the purpose of thinking about alliances or relationships with existing companies, with larger companies, is that those are companies that already have solved that issue of how to relate to consumers. And so for the startups that do have good technology but haven't figured out how to get to market, what they're able to do, if they're able to overcome this sort of fear of losing their technology, of getting ripped off by the big brother, of losing out by partnering up with a larger organization, what they're able to do if they can start to pull their attention away from the product and focus on the consumer and the market by working with larger organizations and partnering up, they're then able to bring their technology to the market. So it's that sort of emphasis really in trying to get people to move away from a product orientation. Now, I mean, I know South Africa a bit, so I was going to play the sort of a dumb foreigner here and say that maybe things are different in South Africa, but do you know what? They're not. In South Africa, startups and entrepreneurs are also very engineering focused and very product oriented. And so this lesson, this painful, Musa had this great phrase of making peace with yourself in a time of change. And for us in our work over the last few years with entrepreneurs, I think that's very much one of the things that we've tried to emphasize, is that many of these individuals, they go down the startup route because they're committed to some sort of engineering solution. They're committed to some sort of product, to some sort of physical artifact or software or something that as, you know, if they're coming from an engineering perspective or a technology perspective, it almost has an aesthetic appeal. And what we've been forcing them to do is to make peace with the fact that just having good technology is not good enough. And they've got to work with customers. They've got to sell that. And often the best way to sell that is working with a larger organization.
Thank you very much. And we'll get into more of that in your session, Andrew. Laurent says, and guys, you're going to meet Laurent prior during session 3, when we talk about cash flow and we get into the nitty gritty of that. He says, Big Brother must please honor obligations on time to help a baby brother with cash flow. Just to add to that particular aspect of this question. It's extraordinarily humbling to go through the questions that we have open here. The challenges that you face, so many of you have started businesses recently. You face very real challenges. So many of you are asking for help and for particular coaching and for very specific ideas. I will say that one of the things that we are trying to get up and running on the micro site, which is the site that where you ended up registering at the end when you got your code, is a networking part of that, where all of you can, once we've got that ready, and I will confirm with you that we are ready tomorrow, or we can confirm that we are ready via social media tomorrow, is for you to go and log what your business is, what it is that you do, and what it is that you want, that you need. Who do you want to network with, or what is it that you want as an input? Some of the people that we have on this session are people that are business coaches. As a business school, we are incredibly fortunate because we get to work with the most extraordinary talent in our classrooms every day, thanks to the leadership of people like John Foster Pedley, Linda Buckley. We've really been able to pivot a large part of this business school to digital in a very short period of time. So for us, the question then becomes, if you're part of this community and we've set this up and you ask these questions, how do we unlock resource for you to help you think beyond these sessions too? So even if we don't answer what you're asking today, we take what you're asking very seriously. We're creating a platform beyond what you see here today. And this helps us shape what we do and how we do with the rest of the series as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing the challenges that you have. that you are sharing with us, and please keep doing so. Coral Lynn from earlier says, thank you for a great response. Musa John, thank you. So Kamugelo, you're saying, we did a survey and spoke to more than 44,000 companies, and more than 90% of them said that they depend on government contracts for their survival. In the use of tenderpreneurs, is the use of tenderpreneurs only limited to small companies? Question mark. In most developing countries, government procurement contributes anything between 20 to 35% of GDP. How does this compare to the UK? Andrew, I don't know if you're able to speak to that particular question.
Sorry, could you repeat it? I'm just scanning the questions as well, sorry.
Certainly.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question goes to the extent to which government contracts with small businesses contributes to the GDP of the country. Here it says, in most developing countries, government procurement contributes to anything between 20 to 35% of GDP. What is the situation in the UK? So in your experience, small businesses, government, what is that relationship and how does it play out?
I think overwhelmingly government procurement contracts go to big business, not to small business. But the UK has, over the last few years, worked really hard in ensuring that the UK government adopts best practice in procurement and in payment policies. So it's now no longer just the central government, also local authorities, the sort of the quasi-state sector like universities and schools that have to adopt a payment policy whereby all payments have to take place within a certain period of time. And it's the practice of trying to withhold payments for longer periods is actually now something that is almost demonized in the press. So I think that we've moved quite a long way in that particular direction, but that's not as a response to the crisis. That's been over the last few years.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions here from services companies that are impacted, of course, in different ways by the lockdown. Nikki Wagner says, hi, Musa and John. Her company is called The Production Line. We offer marketing project management services. How fast do you think we should be changing our business direction without, considering the fear of making the wrong decisions? And to what extent does this depend on the business that we find ourselves in? What are your thoughts? Anything that you'd like to share from that perspective?
I'm happy to chip in here. I mean, I think that one of the things that that I would say is that this is a moment of real cultural change. I think that it's been, many commentators have said that, well, it's the new normal, or we're not going to go back to the way that we were before. And that often refers to specific practices like working from home or whatever. But what I tend to see is that there is a more fundamental cultural change that's going on here. So that some of the things that seem to me to be coming across are a much greater emphasis on community. I think that in the introductory comments, John mentioned this need to, or this desire to have more stronger values operating through society to move against the kind of greed is good ethos that has dominated the latter 20 years or so of globalization. And so I think that, I just see that some of the startups that are really doing well in the UK in the last few weeks have just caught that zeitgeist. They've just caught the moment. And they're just, it's so easy to promote your products on social media. If you just catch the moment, if you just catch something about the empathy that communities nowadays want to show to one another, because they can't, because they're locked in their houses. So how do we relate to each other as a society? Well, there is this groundswell of the need to communicate empathetically via social media. And so I've seen clothing companies set up, and in 2 days, their adverts have gone viral because their brand is so right for the moment.
Thank you, Andrew.
Is that maybe a comment as well, perhaps?
Please do.
So the question was about the speed, I think, how fast, and the danger of these new things. I mean, the question to me is, how are you going to learn this stuff? You know, you can learn from books, you can learn by studying, you can build great mental models, but actually it's mostly experiential. If you've got a good learning mechanism, journal, refer, check, notice what's going on, really be aware of what's happening, try things out. There's a relatively low risk to you in some respects, because, you know, first mover advantages, I think, are quite significant at the moment. And if you want to learn new models and new directions, have a go. Obviously, don't throw your old business out the window. The fact is the scenario has changed and you've got an opportunity to try experimentation in a way that was never available before. So the whole scenario has changed. So just have a go. And if you want to know about speed, I would say start quickly without losing everything you knew before. So be brave, have a go.
Thank you, John. Musa, I'm coming over to you for the last thought on that particular question, but I think also perhaps the closing thought from our panel for this particular session. And so with your answer there, also an answer to Bronson Mokabela's question, who asks for a word of encouragement based on the fear that companies may not be looking for long-term value at this particular point in time. And what would you say to that?
Hello?
Musa, we've got you. Can you hear us?
I don't think Musa got that. So,
Musa, can I ask you the question again?
Yes, please do. Sorry, the line was a bit sketchy, so I heard it in parts, but I didn't hear the full question.
Okay, thank you. I'm coming over to you for the last comments, closing comment from our panelists for this particular session before we close our session out. So perhaps a final thought then on Laura's question around how quickly to pivot and when to make the decision to do so. But then also with that, Bronson Mokabela is asking for words of encouragement. I think many people want those at the moment. But a particular fear around companies looking for short-term value rather than looking for a long-term relationship and value at the moment. So some encouragement there, and as a closing thought, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, because if we think about the reality is that everybody is still seeking value, right? So that hasn't gone off the table, which is the irony. The irony is that we just all have to literally put on a new set of spectacles and try and figure out what value may look like now. So value changes and it morphs. It's very much like energy. It doesn't actually die. So the trick here is to spend a lot of time thinking about what value now means, all right? And even if it's short-term value, it still means something. It manifests as something. And we can take a very clear leaf out of the big consulting firms. I think they're phenomenal at doing two things. The first is they're probably the only industry where you can walk into a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and tell the CEO what to do with his business and you'll listen. And that only comes because you've been able to collect enough data and information and develop an understanding and rapport to be able to do that. And the second thing is, based on that data and that understanding, you're able to continue to reinvent yourself given the value that is required to be created. And I think that's probably the most important thing to take out of it, is that spend a lot of time, and I think we started with this statement, spend a lot of time understanding what it is that your customer wants to achieve. Spend a lot of time obsessing on that point. And when you can do that, that's only when you'll start to see your solution in the correct context. Don't become caught up in how wonderful your service is or how amazing your platform is. Don't make that mistake. Obsess on the value that is perceived from the customer that you're trying to serve. And I think through that lens, you'll be able to have a better view, even if it's short-term or long-term value, you'll have a better view of how to show up to be able to get that out of your client or your customer.
Thanks so much. So collaboration is going to be at the order of the day. New ways of creating value, new connections, new conversations. Thank you so much to our panelists today. So to John, to Andrew, we'll see you again later in the session. Musa, you too will be coming back in the session, and we look forward to that. So ways to get into social marketing. Thank you very much indeed. To everybody who joined us today, thank you. Tomorrow we've got Mark Oppenlau with us, who will be talking about resilience and leadership in a time of crisis. I thought it would be a fantastic idea to put a little playlist together for us over the course of this particular program, because as you know, when times are tough, there's nothing like a little bit of music to get us going in the way that we need to. So this is the first one. It's Kokota, for those of you that know it. I'm going to be signing out like that, Musa. I love it. So I'm going to be signing out, and we're going to be leaving this particular track on for a minute to make sure that your evening gets going in the right way. So thank you, everybody. Over and out.